Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and it is Tuesday, March 16th, 2010. We're sure glad to have you here today. Today we're talking about Open Source, a guide for the school district technology team, with Gene Broderson from the Technology Leadership Network at the National School Board Association, and Benoit St-André from Revolution Linux. Welcome, Benoit, and welcome, Gene.
Hello, everyone.
Gene, so I've turned your mic off, so you'll have to turn it back on and then off again to speak. So the future,
okay,
go ahead.
Thank you.
There you go. So want to say hi?
Hi, everybody. And apologies for my lateness.
So Future of Education is sponsored by Illuminate. Coming up on conversations.net and futureofeducation.com, of course, today talk. The PBS Women of Science session tonight was just canceled. Tomorrow, education. Also, lots of good recorded session topics. If this is your first time in Illuminate, it is. Is my audio breaking up? It sounds like.
Yes, it is.
I've turned my mic up. Let's see how that does. Any better?
Okay. Seems to be cutting in and out a little bit.
Okay, so Benoit and Gene, if you wouldn't mind turning your mics off, there may be a little bit of a mic conflict. If this is your first time in Illuminate, it is a participative environment, and we hope that you have, Linda, the PBS session for tonight was canceled. PBS had to cancel that tonight. This is a participative environment, and we hope that you will participate. You can use the emoticons at the bottom of the participant window, smiley face, clapping hand, confused look, or thumbs down. If you have a question for Benoit at an appropriate point or during the Q&A, there's a larger button with a hand and a green up arrow. You can click on that to raise your hand and we'll give you the microphone. If you think you'd like to take the microphone, then be sure to go up to Tools, Audio, and run the audio setup wizard to make sure your mic is working at the time. You'll see you can send messages back and forth. You'll probably also have noticed that you can send a message to another individual in the room, but do be aware that those private messages are seen by the moderator, so there's nothing entirely private. The presentation's on the whiteboard, and I'm going to give you permission right now to actually participate by modifying the whiteboard. Look for the wand with the red star at the end, click on that, and then click on the map and let us know where you are. I know some of you shouted out your location and the weather in the chat. You're welcome to do that again if you'd like. Well, wherever you're listening from, or if you're listening on the recording, we're sure glad to have you here. I'm going to turn the time over to Gene now, who will get us started.
Thanks, Steve. I hope everybody can hear me okay. I'd like to welcome you. This is our first entree into working with Illuminate and with Steve and Benoit. So this is kind of a very exciting opportunity for me to learn from a master. And I want to thank Steve once again for helping me with this. I'm going to go ahead and go to my slides here. Once again, this is the Technology Leadership Network, which is part of the National School Boards Association. And we're here to learn about, oops, I see I have a problem with my slides. The wrong slides loaded up.
Gene, are you still on Rome?
Oh, I'm sorry. There we go. It turns out that the wrong slides loaded up, Steve, in this last minute error.
Darn.
So let me do this. Once again, the Technology Leadership Network is part of the National School Boards Association. And rather than delaying anymore, trying to deal with things, let me introduce Benoit, and we can get started with this webinar. Benoit started his career as a high school science teacher and did planning for technology in those schools. Afterwards, he was appointed educational consultant on technology for the school district and was responsible for technology integration through the district. Then he became curriculum specialist for science and technology and was in charge of professional development for curriculum reform at that time. He was then one of the authors of a science and technology textbook series for secondary curriculum. During that time, just before working at Revolution Linux, he also did some consulting, professional development, and conferences about free and open source software and open content. At Revolution Linux, he is the Educational Resources Director. He bridges the gap between IT and educational needs. And with that, I turn this over to you, Benoit.
Thank you, Gene. Thanks, Steve, also for giving me this opportunity. I'll try to start up my video, so it feels like I'm actually talking to some people, although I see that 78 people is pretty good. So I'll be starting a piece on open source, a guide for school districts technology leadership team. So I might.
Hey Benoit, you're really stuttering for me.
Off. So poor sound. Okay.
Not yet.
Is it better? Yeah. I'll try to bring this back. So not yet. So I turned video down.
Seems like it might be getting a little bit better. Hey, would you go?
Is it better now for everyone?
I'm sorry, everybody, to do a little behind the scenes work here. But Benoit, would you go up to Tools, Preferences, and change your audio or your connection rate?
Yes.
Maybe lower it down to wireless.
Yeah. Yeah, is it better?
Sounds better so far.
Okay.
Keep talking.
Good. So I'll try to start, and if it stutters again, oh yes, 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 yes. So everybody says yes, so it might be better. And I'm speaking fast, so with a large French Canadian accent, you might have noticed. So I'll maybe slow the speed down a little again, and let's say, is this better now?
Benoit, do you have the ability to call a telephone line?
No. Okay, so I might try to join in.
I'm going to set up the telephone bridge and have you come in by telephone. There must be some problem with your connection, so I'm going to don't cancel this window. So Gene and Benoit, don't hit cancel on this telephone connection that I'm making.
We'll do this over the phone.
And Benoit, turn your microphone off, and then go down to the audio area and click on the handset button. See the opportunity to call in by the telephone line. So Benoit, you're looking for a small icon in the audio box. It says teleconference available. There are the two sliders. And there's a little handset icon you click on that gives you a telephone number to call.
while we're waiting for Benoit, I can do a commercial. Those of you who are familiar with the technology leadership program, we also have something called the technology site visits. We currently have one underway right now that's in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and we have another one coming up in the Eastern Township in Canada, which really should be a very interesting one. It's a lot of one-to-one opportunities there. And then we also have site visits taking place in Illinois, and that session is going to be in the Avoca School District. And why are you back?
Yes, I am. Are you here?
Okay, good.
So Benoit, you're going to need to speak up, and I'm going to try and turn the audio up from my side so we can hear you better. At the same time, also, you still need to click on the small handset button in the audio area below the sliders. There's just a little handset icon. It will make sure that the sound doesn't try and buffer onto your machine.
Okay.
Okay, so I'd say give it a go again.
Go. So it's working now? Everybody is hearing fine?
Yep.
No? Maybe? Yes? Okay, good. Sorry about that. Okay, so back to the session. So open source guide for school districts technology leadership team. So yes, good. So I'm Benoit St-André over the phone now. So I'm from Canada, as you guessed by the accent. I'm Educational Services Director at Revolution Linux. So we're going to talk today about how do you get to implement open source in a school district. Not talking about only the technology part, but how do you make all of this work? So so this is going to be the main topic of the session today. Now, Jean already presented myself just explaining who I was, so I'm just going to go really fast on who am I and what's Revolution Linux, and just going to drop a word on open source, which most of people might know, but I'm still going to just say a word about that so that we're sure that everybody's on the same page. And then I'll go through the guide for the school district. So just Jean said it. I was science teacher. I taught science in high school, but I did all sorts of things like I taught chemistry, biology, geography, because when you're starting teaching, and they give you almost anything, so it was just part of my task too. And from the beginning of my career, almost 10 years ago, I started helping people integrating technology in the classroom as a teacher first, and then as a ed consultant. So that's how it started. And I started using open source in my classroom in year 2000. So that's quite a long time ago for most open source people. So at the time there wasn't a ton of open source software, and it was pretty different. So all I'm going to talk to you today is around all those experiences I had with open source and that organizations I've worked with had with open source, either because I was in those projects myself, or I worked for a consultant at the time to help those school districts try not to do the things that we shouldn't for that. So just a word on Revolution Linux, the company I work with. So we're open source specialists for mainly K-12, but also for government and public sector and corporations. So we do mainly, you can see on the little slide, netbooks, infrastructure, web services, compliance, one-to-one. So everything for integrating open source in a scalable and sustainable way. So that's it. So a word on open source, just so that we're all on the same page. So open source is all about openness, but also freedom. So there's a way that we define open source in English, which is free software, which is a bit confusing because it's mixing the value of the software, the fact that it's free, and the fact that it's freely available. So in French and in Spanish we use the word libre or libre, which is for the freedom to use the software, and that's mainly what open source is about. It's not really about the cost, although we're going to talk about that a little later on. So for open source, yes, libre in Espanol, technology has to be open when you use open source for any use, and that's mainly one of the criteria to have something open source. And also you have to be able to see, modify, and redistribute the code for the software. Now, if you're in a school district and you're part of the leadership team, you may not want to modify the code and you may not want to redistribute the code, but we're going to see later on those kind of things matter if you want to have the opportunity of repeating your open source initiative later. So let's jump to the guide itself. So like I already said, I've built this guide from experience, and it's going to be a guide in 10 points, mainly oriented in a way to show some of pitfalls or roadblocks that you should avoid when you try to expand open source or do an open source initiative in your school district. Now, I want you maybe to click on the check marks just to say who is now having an open source experience in a school or a school district. So just check the little green arrow. Okay, so who would be thinking about about going with that kind of experience for either the school or the whole school district this year? Just check your green arrow. Okay, so great. And maybe you don't want to say it, but who had a hard time trying to get open source in your school district and maybe had some problems? Yeah, a couple of people. Okay, so we're going to go around on each pitfalls. You may want to share your part of your story either on the chat or maybe tell in a couple of seconds what you've experienced. So we're going to start with number 10, being probably the less important point. And as we're going on, we're going to slowly go to more and more important points up to number 1. So number 10 point on my list of pitfalls on the road to open source would be technical interest superseding user interest. Now maybe I just want to know, maybe raise your hand, your check mark. Who is a tech guy in the school district or tech woman? Okay, who is part of the leadership team? Superintendent? Oh, sorry, I said raise your hand, but I meant check box. So superintendent, leadership team. Who would be on the instructional technology side? Or EdTech consultant? And teacher side? Good. Okay, so we have really a mixed crowd, so that's, and we have Andrew that is all three, so that's great. So we're gonna put a little emphasis on each point so that everybody is happy with what I say. But often open source come by people that are very tech aware, because it's so open and so compelling for people to use, people that have technical background, that it's easy for them to try to bring in an open source project in a school district. Now the problem with that is that if you look at the picture, if you're a tech guy, you probably find that picture beautiful. You see all those network wires, all the colors, they're all for each network separated by color, all the wires tied together, very clean, nice cable management, very, that's really interesting for most of tech people. Problem is that if you're a teacher in your classroom, or even if you're a superintendent, you just look at that and you don't really care about that. Because, I mean, that those wires be well tied together or not, it doesn't affect anything in your classroom, or so you think. So most of the people will say, well, I mean, they don't care, they don't mind about all those things being done nicely and really tied together. But if you're a tech guy, you understand that this is really important, because if all those things are not done properly, well, maybe you're gonna have a hard time repairing your network if there's a problem. And if you're in the classroom, well, those kind of things will affect you, because maybe the internet will just go down, you won't have any access to the network, and then you're gonna be mad, and you wouldn't want to use technology after that. So that's part of the things that that is important in technology. Like somebody commented in the chat, technology is supposed to be invisible for people. The problem is that when it doesn't work, well, it starts to be quite visible that it's not working. So when you're doing an open source project, since normally you have to involve technical people, most of tech people will jump in and put technical interests on the table. Things have to be secure, they have to be reliable, we have to be able to put this on a large server, those kind of things. And often users don't care. But of course, if you're running this technology on a poor server that will break, then users will care. Thing is, just not to put technical interests on top of users' interests. So those kind of things have to be on the same page, at the same table. Even though you get the fastest server on earth, if the software and the way that it's implemented is useless, well, your project is not going to be successful. So all of the pitfalls I'm going to talk about are around what happened in some cases when things went wrong implementing open source. So I'm going to talk more about that, and we're going to mix the pitfalls as we go on. So that was number 10. Number 9, lack of user input. Now look carefully for a user on your slide, and you might find it. Now if somebody finds it, I can maybe send a candy by internet. I don't know if I can. So you might find a user in the upper right corner, very, very carefully hidden. He tries to say something, but nobody hears from him. So that pitfall, the lack of user input in lots of open source projects is often a problem. And I mean, the users usually want to say something, but nobody listens to them. Not mainly because nobody cared. It's just that there wasn't anything planned or thought in advance so that users could express themselves. We're not talking about doing a survey or something very, very large, but when you're doing an open source implementation, you have to find a way to bring the most people you can on the bandwagon so that they feel listened to, but also that you have an idea of their real needs. And not just like, okay, I want an icon that is an icon that will be on my desktop that will be blue or gray or pink, whatever that is. But having the user's feedback before you actually implement something is quite important if you want to have a successful implementation. Successful implementation, sorry. For example, we could think about most of the places where people will just say, well, I don't want to use Linux, for example, on the desktop. I just want to have Windows. And most of the time when you're going to talk to them, you just realize that it's not that they want Windows that bad. It's just that they want to have an environment that they're going to feel confident using, and that they're gonna know their way around in that environment. And mostly because they never touched the Linux desktop or open source software, well, they think it's going to be very hard for them to learn. So if you have those kinds of input, well, you can think in advance of some workarounds and some mitigation points so that your things can go forward. So for example, we're going to go to number 8, which are training issues, which is kind of related to the other point before. So the training issues are very important in any open source project that you will implement, mostly because people think that they don't know anything about open source software, and so that they're going to have a hard time doing those kind of things. Sorry, just got a bit of water. So, an important fact about training is the way you plan your training in an open source project. So let's say that you're trying to implement OpenOffice, for example, as an OpenOffice suite. So you're going to try to bring your users in, to think about OpenOffice as not as a super tech tool, but as a way for people to be able to produce text, to do presentations, to use spreadsheets. So you have thought about your things, and you're thinking about training. So lots of times we saw some open source projects and people doing super large trainings. Like, for example, bringing people in a 3-day training on OpenOffice. So way before OpenOffice is installed, because mostly people will want to have trainings on that, they will just say, okay, we need the largest number of days of training possible. So people are going to try to do 3-day training on OpenOffice, having everyone in for, okay, 1 day on the word processor. And then we're going to look at all the menus and all the things you need to do in OpenOffice for it to be working. We use an expression for that I actually took from David Thornburg, which does a lot for open source and instructional technology in general. So David Thornburg said once, this kind of training is just in case training. So we're going to show you all the menus and all the technical possibilities of that software just in case you need to use it. So here's the edit menu, and here's the image menu, and here's how you do fusions and all those things that you could possibly do if you have the chance to do it one time. And the problem is those trainings are not really successful in general, mainly because the people will go out of those 3 days of training and return to class and then have real work to do in class. And while they were 3 days in training, nothing got done there. So we prefer doing other types of trainings, which would be just-in-time training and not just in case. So the idea behind just-in-time training is, and that's exactly what happened in some places in Indiana. So the Indiana Department of Education did in 2005, and maybe earlier than that, a large project called In Access, which was all about doing one-to-one projects in high school with technology. And they did use the Linux platform to do that. Now, the way they introduced all this was to put the technology in the hands of people for them to use it first, and then prepare some just-in-time training. So the idea was that the technology was there, it was working, and everybody could use it. Now, they didn't publicize the thing, and they didn't make everybody jump into it. So they started giving hints and tips of how people could use that, and then they went in the school meeting, for example, it was mainly social studies people and literature teachers. So they met those guys when they were actually able to use the software and when they had real questions about how they were going to be using that in a class in social studies, actually, not using OpenOffice spreadsheet for the spreadsheet itself, but as a tool to learn something and to be able to learn better and to do better projects or better learning in general. So then you can have half a day or 2 hours with somebody that actually knows something about social studies and about open source, so that you can really have a training that's going to be beneficial for the people, so that they can actually go back to class with something they're going to be able to work on, and not just learn anything about software and then go back to class and have nothing more, nothing that is able to work. So that is important too. So let's let's move on a bit on the next slide, which is individual needs versus organizational needs. And this is a bit tricky with open source, and you're going to start to notice that all those slides are not always specially about open source, but they're about any implementation of a large change in general in a school district. That could be curriculum change or technology change, not only open source. Now, this one is a bit more oriented towards open source, simply because it's so easy for everybody to download an open source software and install it that people confuse what they need for themselves and what the organization is able to cope with or needs. It's not because, for example, you can move yourself to OpenOffice that all the school district has to move to OpenOffice at once. The timing and the way that you would do this is not the same thing as you would if it was your personal computer. Now the problem is that most of people today are using what is called a PC, and that's what PC stands for. It stands for personal computer. And if you're in a school district, well, most of the computers are actually used as resources available for everybody. So there's always that kind of mix between, okay, I really want that software badly on my computer, but maybe it's not suitable for all the school district. And since it's so easy to bring in open source because of the cost and because of the way open source programs work very well. So since it's so easy to bring that in, well, people will jump on any software that gets out and say, well, install this the fastest way as possible. The problem is that those kind of things sometimes backfires on people that try to do this, because if the organization is not able to cope with that speed, well, it's going to cause a problem later on. So we're going to go to the next slide, and you're going to see I'm starting to make links between the different slides here. And this is going to be a lot related with the number 7. Number 6 is really, really specific to open source. It's a pitfall that a lot of people fall in when they go to open source. It is changing software and versions too often. Now you might understand and know those words. In open source, there is a motto that was actually driven by one of the founders of Linux, which is Linus Torvalds. Hence the word Linux. It's a play word a wordplay on his name. And it's also Eric Raymond that stated it in a book that is called The Cathedral and the Bazaar. And the motto is called Release Early, Release Often. Now that's mainly what open source is about. So the idea is when you have some code and you program something, the open source way of doing things is just to put it out there, even though it doesn't work. So people just say, well, take that and use it even if it's broken. Now, I'm not telling you to do this in your school district. I'm talking about developers and people that are interested in building open source. So the idea when you do open source software is just to put your code out there and say, okay, this is maybe broken, this is unstable, this is in development, but it works. I mean, there's parts of my code that is working, so well, why don't you take my code and try to make it work? And if you find a bug, we're going to fix it. And if you go to any open source software site to download some, you're going to find that kind of lingo: alpha versions, unstable versions, development versions. Now, often you're going to read warnings on those sites, and it's not fine print. It's usually big enough for people to understand. Those people will write, okay, be careful, don't use this in production. This is there to test. It's there for people to be able to develop. It's not there for production use. And so people might then release the software and say it's beta or it's a release candidate, so it's almost stable, it's coming there. And then they're going to put a stable version on the market and say, well, okay, now if you want to use it in a large environment, you should use that stable version. Now the problem is that most of open source enthusiasts want to use the latest software. Now if you just look at the slide after that, this is, it may be hard to see, but this is software versioning scheme that you can find on Wikipedia. If you look at in software versions, maybe somebody can dig out the link for me while I talk. And I'm going to use that part especially to tell you about an experience of a school district that implemented OpenOffice a couple of years ago that tried to do so. And this school district actually bought 1,500 new computers, and they were looking for software to put on their computers, redoing the image. And the people in the IT department just thought, well, you know, we don't have the money now to buy Microsoft Office licenses, so why don't we put OpenOffice on all those new computers that we just got before we ship them to classes? So they thought, well, let's put OpenOffice on it because it's license free. It's going to be easy to install, and everybody's going to be happy. They're going to have open Office Suite for them. So they installed everything on that, and at the time it was in I think 2005, 2004, 2005. And there was the new version of OpenOffice. It was OpenOffice 1 at the time, and OpenOffice 2 was about to be released. Now it was not released yet. If I go back to my other slide, this was a release candidate, okay? And release candidate is a term to say, well, it's about to be ready, but we still have something to fix. And it's clearly written, this is not for production. But, I mean, they were doing the images and 1,500 computers, you know how long this takes to image, so they just thought, well, okay, the heck with that, we're just going to install OpenOffice release candidate for the version 2, and it's going to be okay, so we're not going to have to do this again. So they installed the OpenOffice that was about to come out, that was not out yet, and they started installing computer in school. Now September came, and guess what happened? People started using OpenOffice a lot, and especially Impress, the software for doing presentations. Now the problem is that that release candidate was really had a big bug, which is that you inserted images into the presentation, which students do a lot. And when you inserted those images in the presentation, well, after a couple of minutes, and if you use a lot of images, your images would be lost and be replaced with red X's. Now, if the tech guys went to the bug tracker of OpenOffice, they would have noticed that that was a known bug, and that was a critical bug that was preventing OpenOffice to get out. And that made a big backlash on their whole idea of OpenOffice, because a couple of weeks later, I think maybe not even weeks, a couple of days later, people complained so bad that actually the school district itself decided to completely remove OpenOffice from all those computers and pay for Microsoft Office. Now, to this day, I don't think that this school district wants ever to hear again about OpenOffice at all. So, and that is what can happen if you change software and versions too often, and if you're not careful about what version you're using and what you're using exactly. Now, most of the people in the proprietary world, they don't look for that because it's a different world, because the software doesn't come out that often, and since people are technical, well, can be technical, the people that can try to drive open source software and school district, well, they might want to use always the latest software, even software that is not out yet, and that can backfire. So I don't say don't test and use open source software on like development versions and beta versions. I just say testing an open source software on your machine, a development version, for example, or a beta version, is not the same thing as trying to deploy 2,500 or 20,000 different installs in the school district. So this has to be thought carefully before. And I'm just saying because open source is moving a lot faster than most of proprietary software, you have to be really careful when you do those kind of projects so that you don't mess up and you're not caught with problems related to that. So let's move forward a bit again, and let's talk about number 5, which is those road bumps and pitfalls on the road to open source are becoming larger and larger. So this is number 5 is interoperability between systems. Now, interoperability is a word to say that those being interoperable means to be able to be not only cross-platform, but also to be able to talk to each other. That's the meaning of interoperability. So normally it means that if you save something in a format, for example, if you would save a picture in the JPEG format, JPG, JPG. So the JPG format is actually an open format and an interoperable format. We know how it's made, and we know how you can save on JPG format, so that in fact other software can read that. Now, the 3 software that I have on my slide are different kind of software that you can use. So the one on the left is Firefox. So Firefox is an open source web browser. The one in the middle is Audacity, which is made for audio recording and audio editing. Very useful to do electronic portfolios, for example, not to do the portfolio itself, but to be able for students to record themselves and have bits and pieces of either how they talk or what or oral reports that they do or things like that. And the one on the right is OpenOffice. Now, I chose those software mainly because they are cross-platform. So I'm bringing interoperability to a larger sense. The idea is that being interoperable is being able to talk to each other, but if you want an open source project in your school district to succeed, you also have to think about people that are not using open source or that are not on a Linux platform. So we saw a lot of projects, open source projects fail because people did open source project on the side. They did that without looking at all the others, the other technology platform that they had. A simple example of that is that if you need other login and password to go in the Linux lab that you just installed, and if you go on those machines, for example, you just bought netbooks and you install Linux on them, and you don't think about how you can connect those netbooks to what you already have, well, then people are going to use those kind of technologies and say, well, this is different. This doesn't, I can't see my documents. I can't use my own login. So I have to be able to log in and to go back to my things. So you don't want people to start to mess around with USB sticks and those kind of things if you already had logins and passwords for everybody. So making sure that you can use open source on the platform, but also that you could use the products of what you're doing on the other platforms of your school district is critical. So in the project that we did with Revolution Linux, but also with what I did when I was working in the school district, we always tried to make sure that, for example, if we use OpenOffice, well, we be sure that OpenOffice is installed on the other machines, on the Windows machines, on the Macs, even though there is still Microsoft Office on that, because this way you're sure that people will use it wherever they go and that they can access to my documents, the same folder that they would use on a Linux machine or on a Mac machine. So this is, I mean, it can go down to simple things as making sure that the menu you're doing in your open source desktop project, for example, looks the same as the Windows menu that you already did. It's not to mimic exactly what the other system is doing. It's just making the transition simpler. Now we're gonna go a bit faster around that. For the lack of local support, number 4, And it's a bit funny because Steve was looking at the slide before and said, well, you're missing a picture on number 4. Well, actually, there's no picture because there's no local support. So that's the whole point of this slide. There is no local support in most of the projects I saw that wanted to go really fast. And the problem is that if you don't think about having local support, and I don't mean having a local tech guy in the school, I just mean having somebody in the school that that is a leader, and somebody talked in the chat about that earlier, making sure that you have leaders, and not only one. Make sure that if you start an open source project, it's not a small pilot project that you're going to put tons of money in it, because when it's going to be over, there's not going to be any more money, and there's not going to be any more people that were specially there in your pilot project to do special things. So if you do an open source project and you want it to be successful, make sure that you have a couple of people. They don't have to be very technical. They just have to be willing to learn a bit and willing to share their things with others, so that they can be a reference point for people in the school, but also make sure that those people can have, I don't know, the cell phone number of the tech guy, so that they are a resource, but they have some resources themselves to help others if you want to go further. And yes, you can even use. I mean, I've seen a lot of initiatives use students for that. But don't only rely on the students. Rely on a network of people that can help. Because otherwise you get your people burnt out, because it's always the same people that will be referred as the techies or the geeks of the school. So you don't want people to do those kind of things. Number 3, and we're going larger and larger on the size of the pitfall that we can fall into, is buying a product without giving the same kind of support as you usually do. Now, lots of people will choose open source to an extent as a product. So they will choose to go, and I use a lot OpenOffice, but because it's often it's a software that is so big that people will just choose that and say, let's go to OpenOffice. I mean, we choose that direction, so we're going to go this way and go OpenOffice. The problem is that when you do any IT project, there are a couple of things that you always do. Normally, you're going to choose the software. You're going to put your IT folks on that. Maybe you're going to do a report or check all the other software that is available to compare. And the problem with open source is that people may buy the idea of open source or of buying in their head OpenOffice. The problem is that if you don't give the same kind of support as you usually do when you choose another product, well, they can compete on an equal ground. And if you don't, for example, if you don't think about planning your training, if you don't think about having local resources, well, and you thought about all that for Microsoft Office, well, of course your project is going to fail. If you don't give the same amount of criticity and seriousness to your open source project that you would do to any other project, well, you're going to have problems in the end. And that's exactly the example that I took before for OpenOffice that was put on the machines without telling everybody in the summer. Well, those people were mad because, I mean, there wasn't any support. There wasn't anything that was preparing people to receive that. And plus, well, it's like they just had a free lunch and everybody said, well, there's food on the table. But if you didn't think about putting tables, actually, putting trash cans, putting everything that makes people happy to have a lunch, actually, well, people are not going to be happy because there's just free food on the floor. So maybe that's a weird example, but that's how it turned out. And this is a part of number 3 also, is when you're looking at doing an open source project, often it will need some hardware to work, either for desktops or for servers in the back end. And the problem is that a lot of time people will buy a product or buy hardware and put so much focus on the hardware part at the wrong time. The problem is that if you do that, for example, and we had the people that called us, after they actually bought a lot of thin clients, for example. So they bought a super large amount of thin clients. They spent a lot of money in that piece, and actually the thin clients weren't quite compatible with the open source software that they were using. I mean, you don't have only these issues with open source. You have these issues with any tech problem. So if you don't check before if it's compatible and if it will fit the needs of the things you will do, then you're going to run into trouble. So if it's not making sure that only making sure that the hardware works, it's putting the emphasis on the right things at the right time, and hardware is one of them. But if you're not careful and you buy a super large server, but you didn't check before if the Moodle install that you were going to do, for example, really needed that kind of server before doing so, well, you're just going to have oversize your server or spend maybe half of your budget in a server that didn't need to be so huge. So that's one other example. Number two, and I know we're running down the time, is neglecting user interface. Now, if anybody knows what that interface looks like, it's a really largely used CMS that stands for Content Management System, and it's called Drupal. Now, Drupal is actually used by the White House. So if you go to whitehouse.gov, you're going to see a Drupal site. And this is actually what the interface to manage Drupal looks like at first when you use that. Now, I'm not telling you not to use Drupal. I'm telling you that if you want to use Drupal for the school district's website and you want to give this to your 5,000 member of staff that can publish a web page if they want to, well, they're just going to open that and say, where is the create a page button? I don't see it. And they're right. This interface is for system administrator, it's not for teacher. So just taking the time to do little things like a landing page where people could just press a button saying create a page is really simple for most of those kind of software. Just making sure that the wallpaper actually has 4 buttons that can say internet, and maybe not Firefox, but just internet so that people are not lost. And people that are really techy, they'll find their way around anyway. We just don't want to drop the large number of people that don't have time to fiddle around, but that still want to use technology to a certain point, who want to make their life easier. So it's not because I don't understand Drupal, it's just because I don't want people to fiddle around just for creating a web page. We want people to be able to work with things. And the number one issue about the pitfall, I would say, that is the largest about using open source software is going for open source only to save money on license fee. And the fact is actually most of the people that are talking about open source are talking about saving money. But you know what? If you go to open source only for that, your project is likely to fail. Because if you look at what does it cost for a technology project to be successful, you have to pay licenses. Okay, so that's what you wouldn't pay for open source. But outside of that, you would need to pay for hardware. You would need to pay for training your tech staff. Or maybe you're not going to train your tech staff. Maybe they're going to learn by themselves. But this is going to take time for them to do so. Maybe they're going to hire people like Revolution Linux to help them. Maybe they're going to do it themselves. They're going to do the install. They're going to do the support. Maybe they're going to hire people for support, and they're going to train users. And all those costs, because those are real costs, have to be taken in account when you do any technology project. So if you go for open source only to save money on license fee, well, at first, and if you talk to any people in the superintendent team that will look at the budget, they will just see you in the hour and say, didn't you tell me that open source project was supposed to save us money? Because I look in my budget and it's not saving us anything this year. Of course, because you're changing, you're moving to another platform. And we have an example of somebody you might meet if you come to ISTE in Denver at our open source pavilion this summer. which is his name is Randy Orwin. He was a technology director in Bainbridge in Washington State. And they actually moved to OpenOffice, and the first year they didn't save anything because they actually took all the money for the licenses and put that in training and professional development. And this was key for the success of their thing. Otherwise, this wouldn't be any success if they just took all the license money and put that back in the general fund. Because in the end, well, everybody would have a new software in their hands without any support and without any training. So in the end, maybe on a 3 to 5 year basis, you're going to save money, but don't only rely on that for things to be successful. So I hope you found that interesting. I hope you had a lot of smiles on your face listening to my accent. So if you have any questions, I'm going to stay a bit on the chat, and you have my contact info on the slide. So thanks everybody for that. I suppose that Steve, you might join in for closing comments.
Actually, I'm going to turn it over to Jean. Jean, do you want to give them a little promo for what you're doing? Turn your mic back on, Jean.
Learning 2 new technologies is challenging. I want to thank you, Benoit, for a great presentation. And if it was just watching the chat that was going on while you were talking, as you were changing topics, so was the chat. So it was kind of really interesting to see, and a lot to be learned just from both what you had to say and what was going on in the chat. So it was a great experience. I think there are a couple of questions, and maybe we can have time for 1 or 2. Steve?
Let's do this. Those of you who budgeted an hour, please feel free to leave. We don't want you to feel like you have to stay, but we'll stay around for a few minutes, and Benoit can answer some questions. We sure appreciate your coming today. Thanks from TLN, and thanks from futureofereducation.com. And Benoit, I think you'll stay on. So those of you who need to go, please feel free to go. There is a survey at the end that will pop up for you. And those of you who would like to stay, we'll now sort of turn this into a more informal Q&A for, say, the next 10 minutes. So if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to put it in the chat. If there was a question you asked earlier and it didn't get answered, again, put that in the chat. Or you can use the hand with the green up arrow to raise your hand and ask a question using the microphone.
Maybe I'll take the comment about there's Larry Anderson saying not much has said about convincing school board members about open source. Any ideas? Well, one of the problems about only wanting to convince board members to go open source is that if it's just for the open source part of things, this will not work. It's like just convincing people to save money and license fee. This has to be presented to board members most of the time as a way to bring more technology in the hands of students in school, and that's mainly where open source can help us tremendously. So if you are really wanting to push that to board members, using the argument that open source is probably one of the only ways to bring technology to the largest number of people in schools, and actually to the large number of hands of students, it's something that can make the board members agree to those kind of projects. And of course, well, the rest has to be thought of anyway. So it's not a simple road, but it's not a simple road for any technology project in general.
Okay, so Noble, I'm going to give you.
Sorry.
I'm giving Noble the microphone. So Noble, you've been through this before. Just click on your mic button and turn your mic on.
Hi, Benoit. I work with an organization, Education Beyond Borders, and one of our major projects is in South Africa. We're going through this process right now where we are actually helping to develop implementation plans, and there's always that debate over use of open source. One of the things that they've had issues with Ubuntu and the system is the lack of support and so on. So your presentation just definitely hit a very key points. I'm wondering if there's any sort of a evaluation or data getting tools that can help these boards and districts look at this information prior to making any decisions. These districts are very vulnerable to salespeople at this moment, as is many African nations, because they're so wanting to compete on the world stage when it comes to use of educational technologies, and they see that as a way of moving forward. So I don't know if you're aware of any research tools or survey tools that can help them make the appropriate decisions when looking at use of open source.
I don't know any specific tool for that. I know of examples of large countries that moved for their whole educational system, like Macedonia, for example. Macedonia has a one-to-one project that is actually using laptop computers for everybody in the state, which is roughly, I think, 1 million students, using Ubuntu Linux on all the machines. And I mean, for the most part of those things, if you're moving forward with an open source project, being Ubuntu or anything else, well, if you would move forward with Windows 7 or any other platform, you would have technical issues and you would need to call people for support. And I know that for South Africa especially, there are some people there that are supporting that. I mean, Mark Shuttleworth, the founder of Ubuntu, is South African himself. So as for tools specifically, I don't have any under. I don't have any address or anything that I can point you at for now. But I mean, these kind of things are possible. And the experience that we had ourselves, not only for school districts in Canada, but also in the U.S. and in Europe, are pretty relevant for those kind of things. So maybe we can go back in the chat for other questions. I saw a question for the conference will be available as a recording. How do you support Linux software and software that will not run on Linux? From Deborah Boatwright. That is a good question. Normally, it's not about having. I mean, it's about choosing the software, not the software, but the task that you want to solve, and now not choosing the software. So you want to look for a software to do a presentation, not look for PowerPoint. And that's mostly what we're supposed to teach in schools. We're teaching skills. We're not teaching software. So if you look at that angle for software, it's really easy to find very good open source software that actually are able to solve the needs that you have, to address the needs that you have. And if you have software that you really want to have working in Linux, you have different possibilities. First, there's a software called Wine, W-I-N-E, like the wine you can drink. But it's actually made for run Windows programs on Linux. It's not always working, but if your software can run into Wine, it's a way to keep it open, to keep it working in a Linux world. There are some software that you can buy actually that are working on Linux, like they would be on Mac, for example, or on Windows. The software provider chose to make this software work on that. The second way of doing so, which would be to find something that would do the same task under Linux or in the open source world than the software that you were having at first. And the third way to do so is a way that we do often with thin clients. That would be answering also another question. The places that we implemented open source in school district have various ways of doing so. So some places they're using it on a desktop. Some places they're using that in the infrastructure. Some places they're using open source on thin clients and on fat clients. So the third way for me to access Windows software or software that doesn't run on Linux would be to run it from a terminal server, from a Windows terminal service, for example. and make that make a remote connection with a remote desktop RDP to the Windows environment for student information system, for example, that wouldn't work on Linux. That's another possibility.
So I think it's time to end. I did want to give a... Go ahead, Benoit.
Yep, no problem.
I was just going to say, Randy Orwin is going to be in the same series, the TLN series, and that will be on April 27th, talking about open source intelligent implementation, and that will be at 3 p.m. Eastern Time and 12 noon Pacific. We're sure glad to have you here. Gene, want to say final goodbye?
Sure. Once again, thank you all. And we're going to be posting the link on our site, nsba.org/webchannel-TLN. And we'll also list the upcoming webinars there as well. So please come by and visit the site and look for additional information as well. And once again, thank you all.
Terrific. Thank you, Gene. Thanks, Benoit. Thanks, everybody, for putting up with a couple of minutes of sound issues as we got Benoit on the telephone. Sure glad to have you here today. And what a great topic and a great audience. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.